The hegemony had always prided itself on being the galaxy's most sophisticated collection of species, a statement that would have been considerably more impressive if it weren't delivered with the same smug confidence as a child showing off their butterfly collection. For 3,000 cycles they had catalogued, dissected, and ultimately domesticated every sentient race they encountered, turning the vast expanse of space into their personal zoo. Their latest acquisition came from a dreary little rock orbiting an unremarkable yellow star, a planet whose inhabitants had the audacity to call themselves the dominant species despite lacking even basic faster-than-light travel. The hegemony's xenobiologists had initially dismissed the world entirely. After all, what could possibly be interesting about a species that still fought wars over resources and geographical boundaries? But then the preliminary scans had revealed something curious. These humans possessed an unusually robust physiology paired with an almost pathological tendency toward violence. Perfect specimens for the research division's ongoing project to understand the correlation between aggression and biological adaptability. The specimen acquisition had been embarrassingly simple. One transport beam, one sleeping human female, and suddenly the hegemony had added another entry to their ever-expanding catalog of conquered biology. The irony that they needed to wait for their target to fall asleep spoke volumes about their confidence in their own superiority. The containment facility on Research Station Nexus 7 buzzed with the kind of academic excitement typically reserved for discovering a new method of cellular mitosis or successfully cloning an extinct species. The human female lay motionless in the center of a hexagonal cage, her dark hair spread across the cold metal floor like spilled ink. The cage itself was a marvel of hegemony engineering. Force fields calibrated to contain everything from the methane-breathing giants of Proxima Forge to the energy-based lifeforms of the crystalline nebula. The scientists had configured it for a standard carbon-based bipedal organism, adding a few extra containment protocols because the preliminary data suggested humans were moderately more dangerous than the average primitive species. The lead researcher, a towering figure with 6 arms and an attitude that could freeze helium, dismissed the containment measures as excessive. Through the observation deck's reinforced viewing panels, the assembled team watched their subject with the detached interest of entomologists studying a particularly unremarkable beetle. The human's vital signs displayed across holographic monitors: heartbeat steady, brain activity minimal, respiratory function normal. Everything precisely as expected from a species that had barely managed to escape their own gravity well. The xenobiologists had already prepared their analysis reports, confident in their understanding of human physiology based on intercepted medical data and long-range biological scans. Humans were, according to their models, a textbook example of evolutionary compromise, too weak to survive in most galactic environments, too slow to compete with proper predatory species, and too emotionally unstable to achieve true civilization. The fact that they had somehow managed to avoid destroying themselves was attributed to sheer dumb luck rather than any inherent capability. The research team activated their standard examination protocols with the casual efficiency of mechanics performing routine maintenance. Molecular scanners mapped the human's cellular structure while neural probes attempted to access her consciousness. The preliminary results confirmed their expectations. This was indeed a primitive organism, operating on basic survival instincts, no different from the countless other species they had catalogued over the millennia. The lead researcher initiated the first phase of active experimentation with the kind of clinical detachment that made dissection sound like a casual Tuesday afternoon activity. Micromanipulators extended from the laboratory's ceiling, their precision instruments designed to conduct exploratory surgery on any biological system in the known galaxy. The human skin yielded to their molecular cutting tools exactly as predicted, revealing the expected layers of epidermis, dermis, and subcutaneous tissue. The vivisection proceeded according to standard protocol: systematic examination of major organ systems, tissue sampling, and detailed documentation of biological responses. The human's cardiovascular system proved unremarkable, her respiratory function typical of oxygen-breathing species, and her digestive tract showed the expected omnivorous adaptation. The research team documented everything with the methodical precision that had made the hegemony the galaxy's foremost authority on xenobiology. Then the human's cellular regeneration rate began accelerating beyond theoretical limits. The monitoring equipment registered readings that made the lead researcher's 4 eyes narrow in concentration, The molecular scanners detected structural changes occurring at the quantum level, alterations that their models insisted were impossible for a species of this developmental stage. The examination tools encountered unexpected resistance as they attempted to penetrate deeper into the human's biological system. What should have been routine tissue analysis became increasingly difficult as the subject's body began responding to the intrusion in ways that defied their understanding of basic biology. The readings climbing across their holographic displays suggested that something fundamental about their assumptions had been catastrophically incorrect. The lead researcher's confident demeanor wavered as the human's vital signs began exhibiting patterns that existed nowhere in their extensive database of known species. The research team's confidence evaporated faster than water in a vacuum when their instruments began registering readings that belonged in theoretical physics textbooks rather than biological analysis reports. The human cellular structure was rewriting itself in real time, displaying adaptive capabilities that made their most advanced bioengineering look like primitive cave paintings. The lead researcher's 6 arms moved frantically across control interfaces, recalibrating sensors that insisted on providing impossible data about a species that was supposed to be barely more sophisticated than the fungal colonies they had cataloged last rotation. The holographic displays flickered with cascading error messages, as the monitoring equipment struggled to process biological transformations that violated several fundamental laws of xenobiology. The human's DNA sequences were reorganizing themselves with a precision that suggested either millions of years of evolutionary refinement, or the kind of adaptive programming that only existed in the hegemony's most classified military projects. The uncomfortable possibility that they might have catastrophically underestimated their subject began creeping through the research facility like a slow-acting toxin. The xenobiology team activated emergency protocols designed for containing specimens that exceeded their initial classification parameters. Additional force field generators hummed to life around the containment cage, while automated systems began flooding the chamber with sedative compounds proven effective against 97% of known carbon-based life forms. The human's vital signs remained stubbornly stable, completely unaffected by chemical cocktails that should have rendered her unconscious within seconds. The facility's director arrived at the observation deck with the kind of urgency typically reserved for impending stellar collapse or budget committee meeting. Through the reinforced viewing panels, the assembled scientist watched their subject with growing unease as her body continued exhibiting properties that challenged their understanding of biological possibility. The casual dismissal that had characterized their earlier observations was rapidly being replaced by the kind of professional concern that preceded very awkward conversations with supervisory committees. The decision to proceed with the vein opening procedure came from a combination of scientific curiosity and bureaucratic stubbornness that would have been admirable if it weren't so monumentally stupid. The lead researcher activated the molecular extraction tools, reasoning that direct access to the human circulatory system would provide the definitive biological data they needed to understand her anomalous properties. The precision instruments penetrated the subject's major blood vessels with the clinical efficiency that had made the hegemony's research division the galaxy's premier authority on xenobiological analysis. The human's blood flowed into the collection apparatus with the deep crimson color typical of iron-based oxygen transport systems, initially confirming their expectations about her basic physiological architecture. The automated analyzers began processing the samples, mapping protein structures and identifying cellular components with the methodical precision that had cataloged biological systems across 3,000 star systems. The results displayed across their holographic interfaces showed exactly what they had predicted, until the molecular structure began changing. The blood samples were rewriting their own genetic code while under observation, transforming from standard human physiology into something that made their most advanced biological weapons look like amateur chemistry experiments. The containment protocols designed to handle hazardous biological materials activated automatically as the samples began exhibiting properties that belonged in military research rather than xenobiology lab. The extraction process that was supposed to provide answers was instead generating questions that made the research team wish they had chosen safer careers in stellar cartography. The human's transformation accelerated as her circulatory system responded to the vein opening procedure like a complex biological machine receiving its activation signal. Her cellular regeneration rate increased exponentially while her neural activity patterns began resembling the kind of quantum processing that existed only in the hegemony's most sophisticated artificial artificial intelligence system. The monitoring equipment registered energy signatures that suggested her body was drawing power from sources that their instruments couldn't identify or measure. The facility's security systems began registering containment breaches that didn't technically exist yet, but were somehow inevitable. The force field generators surrounding the human's cage flickered with the kind of instability that preceded catastrophic system failures, while the automated defenses prepared for threats that their programming couldn't properly define. The research station's artificial intelligence began implementing emergency protocols designed for scenarios that the hegemony's military planners had hoped would remain purely theoretical. The human's eyes opened with the kind of awareness that suggested she had been conscious throughout the entire examination process. A possibility that made the research team's earlier confidence seem embarrassingly naive. Her gaze moved across the observation deck with the calculating precision of a predator evaluating potential threats. Displaying intelligence that belonged to species with several thousand years more evolutionary development. The casual dismissal that had characterized their earlier observations was replaced by the uncomfortable realization that they might have been the specimens under examination all along. The lead researcher's attempts to increase the sedative concentration proved as effective as trying to calm a stellar storm with a gentle breeze. The human's body processed the chemical compounds with the efficiency of a sophisticated filtration system, neutralizing toxins that should have been lethal to carbon-based lifeforms. Her transformation continued with the inexorable progression of a biological process that had been designed specifically for this moment. The containment cage that had seemed so impressively secure began showing stress fractures as the human's presence generated forces that existed outside their understanding of physics. The molecular bonds holding the force field generators together were failing under pressures that their instruments couldn't measure but their equipment couldn't ignore. The research facility's structural integrity warnings began cascading across emergency displays, while the automated systems prepared for the kind of catastrophic failure that would require very creative explanations to administrative committees. The human's transformation reached a critical threshold as her biology completed its shift from primitive terrestrial organism to something that made the hegemony's most advanced bioweapons look like children's toys. Her body had become a living contradiction to everything they understood about evolutionary biology, displaying capabilities that suggested either divine intervention or the kind of long-term genetic engineering that only civilizations with millennia of advancement could achieve. The uncomfortable possibility that humanity might not be quite as primitive as they had assumed was rapidly becoming an unavoidable conclusion. The human rose from the containment cage floor, with the fluid grace of someone who had never actually been imprisoned. A realization that made the research team's earlier confidence seem about as substantial as vacuum-packed dignity. Her transformation had completed itself with the kind of biological precision that suggested eons of evolutionary preparation rather than the random cellular chaos they had initially assumed. The force fields that had been designed to contain primitive organisms flickered and died as her presence generated electromagnetic interference that turned their most advanced containment technology into expensive decorative lighting. The lead researcher's 6 arms moved frantically across emergency controls that responded with the enthusiasm of a broken waste disposal unit. The human's body now radiated energy signatures that belonged in stellar phenomena rather than biological systems, her cellular structure having reorganized itself into something that made their periodic table look like a child's alphabet blocks. The monitoring equipment registered readings that would have been dismissed as instrument failure if they weren't being confirmed by 17 different sensor arrays simultaneously. The observation deck's reinforced viewing panels began developing stress fractures as the human's transformation reached its final phase. Her skin displayed a subtle luminescence that suggested her cells were generating their own light source, while her neural activity patterns resembled the kind of quantum processing that existed only in the hegemony's most classified artificial intelligence project. The uncomfortable possibility that they had been studying a deactivated weapons system rather than a primitive organism was rapidly becoming an inescapable conclusion. The human's gaze settled on the research team with the kind of attention that made being examined by a supernova seem preferable to their current situation. Her eyes held intelligence that belonged to species with millennia of technological advancement, displaying awareness that suggested she had been aiming their capabilities while they had been congratulating themselves on their superior understanding of xenobiology. The casual dismissal that had characterized their earlier observations was replaced by the growing realization that they had been the actual specimens under examination. The facility's automated defense systems activated with the kind of urgency typically reserved for imminent stellar collapse or unexpected budget audits. Weapons platforms designed to neutralize the galaxy's most dangerous biological threats emerged from hidden compartments, while energy barriers attempted to isolate the containment area from the rest of the research station. The human observed these preparations with the detached interest of someone watching primitive insects attempt to construct a meaningful threat. The revelation that humanity had been quarantined rather than ignored struck the research team with the force of a collapsing neutron star. The files they had dismissed as primitive territorial warnings were actually containment protocols established by civilizations that had encountered Earth species and decided that some doors were better left unopened. The hegemony's arrogant assumption that they could improve upon millions of years of galactic policy was about to receive the kind of educational correction that would be discussed in xenobiology textbooks for centuries. The human's voice, when she finally spoke, carried harmonics that suggested her vocal cords had been redesigned for acoustic warfare rather than simple communication. Her words penetrated the observation deck's sound barriers with the efficiency of a molecular disruptor, reaching the research team's auditory systems despite 17 layers of protective shielding. The casual tone she used to announce their impending educational experience was somehow more terrifying than any battle cry could have been. The containment cage that had seemed so impressively secure disintegrated around her like sugar in acid rain. The molecular bonds holding the force field generators together failed under pressures that their instruments couldn't measure but their equipment couldn't ignore. The human stepped through the collapsing containment system with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never actually been trapped, her movements displaying the kind of controlled power that belonged to apex predators rather than primitive organisms. The facility's structural integrity warnings began cascading across emergency displays as the human's presence generated forces that existed outside their understanding of physics. The research station's artificial intelligence began implementing evacuation protocols designed for scenarios that the hegemony's military planners had hoped would remain purely theoretical. The automated systems struggled to process threat assessments for something that exceeded their programming parameters while simultaneously being too dangerous to ignore. The human's transformation revealed why the galaxy's most advanced civilizations had established Earth as a quarantine zone rather than attempting conquest. Her body had become a living demonstration of evolutionary adaptation pushed beyond theoretical limits, displaying capabilities that suggested humanity's true nature had been carefully hidden beneath layers of apparent primitive. The uncomfortable realization that they had triggered a biological weapons system designed by evolution itself was rapidly becoming an unavoidable conclusion. The lead researchers' attempts to activate emergency containment protocols proved as effective as trying to cage a stellar flare with wishful thinking. The human's biology had evolved beyond their ability to contain or understand, her cellular structure having reorganized itself into something that made their most advanced bioweapons look like amateur chemistry experiments. The research facility's defensive systems registered her as simultaneously a single organism and a distributed threat that existed on multiple dimensional levels. The human approached the observation deck with the measured pace of someone conducting a guided tour rather than staging a prison break. Her presence generated electromagnetic interference that turned their communications equipment into expensive paperweights, while her proximity caused their molecular analysis tools to register readings that belonged in theoretical physics rather than biological research. The casual efficiency with which she dismantled their most sophisticated containment systems suggested that escape had never been her primary objective. The observation deck's reinforced barriers proved about as effective as tissue paper against a plasma cutter, when the human decided that direct communication was more efficient than continued observation. She stepped through the supposedly impenetrable defensive systems with the kind of effortless grace that suggested she had been analyzing their weaknesses while they had been celebrating their technological superiority. The research team found themselves face to face with their former specimen, a role reversal that would have been amusing if it weren't so immediately life-threatening. The news of Research Station Nexus 7's complete communications blackout spread through the hegemony's administrative networks, with the kind of viral efficiency that made pandemic outbreaks look like leisurely social gatherings. Within 3 standard cycles, every xenobiology department across 17 star systems had received emergency directives classifying Earth-originated specimens as Class Omega biological hazards, a designation previously reserved for sentient plagues and weaponized stellar phenomena. The bureaucratic machinery that had confidently catalogued humanity as primitive curiosities now scrambled to reclassify them as an existential threat to galactic civilization. The emergency session of the Hegemony's High Council convened with the kind of urgency typically reserved for impending supernova events, or the discovery that their military budget had been embezzled. The surviving automated distress signals from Nexus 7 painted a picture of systematic facility dismantlement that suggested either divine intervention or the kind of advanced biological warfare that only civilizations with millennia of development could achieve. The uncomfortable possibility that they had awakened something that had been deliberately sleeping was rapidly becoming the leading theory among those council members still capable of rational thought. The xenobiology reports that had initially dismissed humans as evolutionary compromises were hastily reclassified as intelligence failures of historic proportion. The research data that had confidently predicted easy domestication now read like instruction manuals for species suicide, complete with detailed explanations of exactly how to activate humanity's defensive protocol. The Hegemony's most prestigious scientists found themselves explaining to increasingly hostile administrative committees why their expertise in galactic biology had failed to recognize a biological weapon system disguised as a primitive species. The humans' systematic dismantling of their research infrastructure proceeded with the methodical precision of someone conducting a comprehensive security audit rather than staging a violent escape. Her approach to destroying their most advanced containment systems displayed the kind of thorough understanding that suggested she had been analyzing their weaknesses while they had been congratulating themselves on their technological superiority. The facility's defensive networks registered her movement patterns as simultaneously predictable and impossible to counter, a combination that made their automated response systems resort to increasingly desperate measures. The revelation that humanity possessed adaptive biological capabilities that exceeded their theoretical models struck the Hegemony's scientific establishment with the force of a collapsing galactic. The research data that had initially suggested humans were barely more sophisticated than their own domesticated species now indicated that Earth's inhabitants had evolved beyond the need for conventional technology. The uncomfortable realization that they had been studying a deactivated doomsday weapon was rapidly becoming an unavoidable conclusion that would reshape their understanding of evolutionary biology for generations. The humans' transformation into something that made their most advanced military assets look like primitive toys proceeded with the inexorable efficiency of a biological process that had been specifically designed for this moment. Her cellular structure continued reorganizing itself into configurations that suggested either millions of years of evolutionary refinement or the kind of adaptive programming that only existed in the Hegemony's most classified weapons project. The monitoring equipment that had survived her initial awakening registered readings that belonged in military intelligence reports rather than biological research documents. The facility's evacuation protocols activated with the kind of desperate urgency that accompanied the discovery of imminent structural collapse or unexpected tax audits. The research staff that had initially dismissed their subject as a primitive curiosity now found themselves implementing emergency procedures designed for containing galactic-level biological threat. The human observed their frantic preparations with the detached interest of someone watching insects attempt to organize a meaningful defense against an approaching storm system. The automated distress signals transmitted by Nexus 7's artificial intelligence painted a picture of systematic facility compromise that suggested the human had been conducting a comprehensive analysis of hegemony technology while appearing to be unconscious. Her escape from containment had been less a prison break and more a graduation ceremony from an intensive course in galactic infrastructure vulnerability. The research station's defensive systems registered her presence as simultaneously a single organism and a distributed threat that existed on multiple dimensional levels. The humans' methodical destruction of their research capabilities displayed the kind of thorough understanding that made their previous confidence seem about as substantial as atmospheric pressure in deep space. Her approach to dismantling their most sophisticated analytical equipment suggested that she had been reverse engineering their technology while they had been celebrating their supposed intellectual superiority. The facility's structural integrity warnings began cascading across emergency displays as her presence generated forces that existed outside their understanding of physics. The hegemony's emergency response teams arrived at Nexus 7 to discover a research facility that had been converted into a comprehensive exhibition of their own technological limitations. The human had systematically dismantled their most advanced containment systems while leaving detailed analyses of their weaknesses displayed on every functional screen throughout the station. Her educational demonstration of galactic military vulnerabilities would have been admirable if it weren't so immediately terrifying to those responsible for maintaining interstellar security. The research station's final transmission included a message that would be studied by xenobiology departments for centuries. A casual observation from their former specimen that humanity had been waiting for someone to finally open the cage. The implication that Earth's quarantine had been maintained by choice rather than necessity struck the hegemony's leadership with the kind of existential dread typically reserved for discovering that their entire civilization had been someone else's experiment. The humans' departure from Nexus 7 proceeded with the unhurried confidence of someone who had completed a successful field test rather than staging a dramatic escape. Her systematic analysis of hegemony technology had provided her with comprehensive intelligence about galactic civilization's capabilities and weaknesses. Information that would prove invaluable for the species-wide awakening that her transformation had triggered. The facility's automated systems registered her final transmission as simultaneously a farewell and a declaration of intent. The emergency protocols that had been designed to contain primitive biological threats proved about as effective as philosophical arguments against natural disasters when applied to a species that had evolved beyond the need for conventional limitation. The human's transformation had revealed why the galaxy's most advanced civilizations had established Earth as a quarantine zone rather than attempting conquest or contact. The uncomfortable realization that they had been the specimens under examination all along was rapidly becoming an inescapable conclusion that would reshape their understanding of their place in the galactic hierarchy. The irony that the hegemony's most sophisticated research facility had been converted into an exhibition of their own arrogance was not lost on the few surviving observers who had witnessed humanity's awakening. The cages that had been designed to contain primitive specimens now displayed the remains of a civilization that had confused technological advancement with evolutionaries. The humans' casual demonstration of their true capabilities had transformed the galaxy's most confident collectors into the newest entries in someone else's catalog of interesting but ultimately limited species.